بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على رسول الكريم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته, and welcome to Fiqh al-Muamalat online course. And today we continue the discussions of the prohibitions of Sharia and Islamic finance, and we have covered basically a few prohibitions before. So we have covered riba interest, we have covered gambling, maisir, we have covered gharar in a series of episodes, and basically we will carry on the remaining part to close with the sessions, the prohibitions of Sharia in the context of Islamic finance. So in addition to what has been discussed before, we have the prohibitions, which is prohibitions of product and services. Meaning that previously we discussed on riba, which is a clear standalone prohibitions. Then we talk about gambling or maisir, which is a standalone prohibitions. Then we talk about gharar, which is a standalone prohibitions. Then we talk about tahrir as well, which is standalone prohibitions, and others. The last cluster is a kind of generic statements that combine a few things which are not allowed in Sharia, which is the prohibitions of product and services. When we talk of prohibitions of the product, here we are talking about the processing and producing and marketing as well, what's so-called the alcohol drinks, which is the khamr. So this is not allowed in Sharia, which means that the Islamic financial institutions cannot involve in a business and activities which deals with the alcohol and in a term of financing or doing some kind of trading facilities on this prohibited elements. The other thing is supplying a non-halal meat, like for example pork and the like. This also falls under the prohibition, so you can't basically provide financing for food processing of pork meat. And the last one is basically related to the services, so you cannot providing, which is related to the providing of immoral services, like for example prostitutions, operating discos and bars and so on and so forth. So this kind of activities, as you can see, which is related to food, drink, and services, are prohibited from an Islamic standpoint, and as a result of that, the Islamic financial institutions are not allowed to provide financing to those institutions which are involved in such activities. However, we have to understand that these prohibitions, which are normally listed as 4, I mean there are many here and there, but if you want to summarize it using the Islamic capital market list of prohibitions, it is easy to capture, which is riba, gharar, maisir, and prohibited product and activity. So this is the main 4 clusters of the prohibitions of Sharia. But when it comes to practice in the activity of the Islamic financial institutions, normally they are customized in a form of checklist in order to screen the requests of financing and also to ease the operations of the Islamic banker and officers to administer the request of financing. Because, you know, when it comes to the financing, the officer cannot just screen his head, you know, and try to figure out what are the prohibitions, but normally it is part of the checklist of the financing. So you have the check of financial standing of the customer, like for example credit score, you check maybe secrets, CITOS, and other screening requirements to ensure the eligibility of the customers for the financing. But there are other also checklists related to the Sharia compliance eligibility for financing, which are normally related to these prohibitions. So you will check this one: no activities of riba, no, for example, involvement in alcohol, in park activities, in immoral activities, in gambling, in riba, in gharar, and so on and so forth. So there are kind of checklists, you know, to go through in order to be eligible for financing. And Islamic banking normally we call it negative list. So the negative list, normally the customers in the negative list are disqualified from obtaining financing, because those basically or these items in the negative list are considered not eligible for Sharia compliance financing. In other words, they fall under the prohibitions of Sharia. But the other point, sometimes we call it escalation list. Some of the items which are not clearly prohibited and which are not really clearly permissible. You know, according to the hadith, there is a kind of clear halal that you know it, like drinking water. And sometimes there is a clear haram, like drinking wine. But sometimes there is something which is a mix in between, you know, which you are not sure whether it is a halal or a haram. That's the area of shubha. So basically, for the halal, is okay for the Islamic financial institution to proceed with the financing. For the haram, it's not okay for the Islamic financing to proceed with the financing, and their stand is to reject that kind of request of financing. But some area which is a little bit mixed, where the financial institution, where the officer is not sure about accepting or rejecting the financing because of the area. And one of the examples that you face in this is, like, for example, the spa facility. The spa is one of the escalation list. Why? Because there are some Sharia compliant spa, meaning that providers of this service try to observe the Sharia requirements in providing the services, try to avoid the prohibitions activities in the spa, try to look after the Sharia requirements, and sometimes they have an appointed Sharia advisors to make sure the operations of the spa is basically in line with Sharia compliance. So those, and sometimes you may see a spa which is a very open, doesn't comply with the Sharia requirements. So you don't know this request of financing in which category would fall. So it goes to the additional assessment and additional screening, and normally it will be escalated to the Sharia board or the Sharia committee for decision making, because it's not somehow within the mandate of the Sharia departments, and it is not clear what the decision should be. So the Sharia board will administer the application and go through the informations provided and look at the recommendation of the Sharia departments and seek more information. Based on that, they may give a decision on that. So there are some kind of escalation lists whereby the institution is not sure about the Sharia stand on this kind of activity, whether it will be permissible or otherwise. So in this case, it will go up to the Sharia board for decision. The other thing that we would like to highlight is that some of the prohibitions of Sharia, or some of the activities of the financial institutions, are mixed. You know, again, you may find a company or a business activity which is a purely halal, like, for example, transportation, normal transportations, which is permissible, normal leasing, which is permissible, and sometimes you will find activity which is clearly prohibited, like, for example, selling alcohol. But sometimes you see an activity which is mixed. Meaning that if you take a 7-Eleven, for example, or other similar outlet of supermarkets, that you may see the entire and the bulk of the activity is halal, like foods and drinks and so on and so forth, and meat. But sometimes you may see non-halal items are sold there. So it is a mix with the halal and haram. So what's the stand here? So the mixed activity actually is one of the areas that sometimes bring debate to the table of the Sharia board, and the decisions may vary from one institution to another institutions. But he will be guided on this with the screening methodology that has been provided, even though that screening methodology is not meant for takaful, it is not meant for Islamic banking, but it is was designed for the Islamic capital market per se and the stock selling per se. But of course, the Islamic financial institutions may refer to it sometimes to be guided as a benchmark to customize their financing. This is why the threshold, the ratios, the stand of the financing when it comes to the financing of mixed company will vary from one institution to another institutions. But when you go to the Islamic capital market, when you go to the stock screening, normally you will see a kind of consistency because a methodology has been provided. Of course, there are different index providers for that. We cannot go through it because this is not the right time to discuss those things, but let's just pick up the methodology that has been used by the Security Commissions of Malaysia, and we take it as a benchmark for our discussions. So normally when it comes to the mixed business activities, again, as I'm telling you, just to remind you, this is not applicable to Islamic banking, but this is more applicable to the stock screening and Islamic capital market. But normally the Islamic banking will benchmark against this, will refer to this, and will be guided for this basically to determine the ratios when it comes to the mixed activities of the Islamic financial institutions. And why we are saying this? Because as you know, in most of the cases, and also in the context of Malaysia, is that banking in takaful is under the purview of the central bank, and the Islamic capital market is under the Security Commission. So the index screening methodology, it is issued by the Security Commission, it is applied to the Islamic capital market, and it is not issued by the central bank, hence it is not applicable and imposed on the takaful or the Islamic banking, but it is left to the Sharia committee to look at the issues, administrate the matters, and take the right decision.